The Walking Dead spent years making you hate Negan. And honestly, it worked. From the moment he stepped out of that RV and started whistling in the dark, the show handed you every tool you needed to despise him. He was loud. He was cruel. He killed two of your favourite characters in front of you with a barbed wire bat while you sat there completely helpless. He made Rick Grimes, the man who had survived everything the apocalypse could throw at him, kneel in the dirt and cry. And then he smiled about it. But somewhere between his entrance and his prison cell, the show was quietly asking a different question. Not is Negan a monster, but what does it actually take to keep people alive when civilization is gone? When you look at the full picture, Negan wasn't the villain the show wanted you to see. He was, in the most uncomfortable way possible, one of the only adults in the room. Tonight we're going to sit with that idea for a while, and I mean really sit with it. We're going to go back to before Negan was Negan, back to the man he was when the world still made sense, and trace exactly how a high school gym teacher with a troubled marriage and a sick wife became the most feared human being in Virginia. We're going to walk through what he built and what he believed, and why the internal logic of it holds up better than the show's framing wanted you to notice. We're going to look at the moments the writers gave us that cut against the villain narrative, and there are more of them than you probably remember. We're going to compare him honestly against every other major leader the Walking Dead universe produced. And by the end of this, I don't think you're going to walk away thinking Negan was a good person. But I do think you're going to walk away with a much more complicated picture than the show's surface ever offered. So get comfortable, this one is going to take a while. There's a version of this story that starts with Negan stepping out of that RV, and if you only know the television show, that might be where your mental picture of him begins. But that version is missing the most important part. Because everything Negan became in the apocalypse was shaped by who he was before it, and who he was before it was not a monster. He was, by every measure that would have mattered in the old world, a pretty ordinary man with ordinary problems and a few ordinary failures he was trying not to think about too hard. His name was Negan Smith. He coached athletics and taught gym at a high school somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area. If you'd passed him in the hallway between periods, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. He was loud in the particular way that coaches and gym teachers are loud, with that energy that seems excessive in a quiet building but makes total sense on a field or in a gymnasium when you're trying to get 20 teenagers to care about something they've already decided they don't care about. He swore more than he should have for someone working in a school. He made jokes that landed somewhere between funny and inappropriate. He gave kids a hard time and then stayed late to help them fix whatever he'd been giving them a hard time about. The comics, the Here's Negan standalone arc, and the tie-in prose fiction fill in the before years in ways the show only gestures at, and it's worth knowing what's there. Not because the show is obligated by the source material, but because the backstory illuminates everything that comes after in a way that makes the full character legible. And the Walking Dead universe has been consistent enough about Negan's pre-apocalypse life that it functions as genuine canon, even for people who primarily watch the show. He had a wife. Her name was Lucille, and she was sick. She'd been diagnosed with cancer and was going through treatment. And Negan was not handling it well. Not in any of the dramatic, visible ways that make for obvious drama. More in the quiet, grinding way that people sometimes fall apart under sustained pressure, without anyone noticing, including themselves. He was working. He was showing up. He was doing the logistical things that a husband in that situation does. But he was also having an affair. Her name was Janine. She was someone he'd met at the school, and the relationship was not some grand passion. It seems, reading between the lines of what the comics and tie-in material give us, like the kind of thing that happens when someone is terrified and doesn't know what to do with the terror. and finds a way to feel something else. For a little while, that's not an excuse. It's just a recognisable human failure, the specific kind where a person does damage they knew they were doing and kept doing it anyway, because looking directly at the alternative felt like more than they could manage. Lucille found out. They had a conversation about it. And then, before anything could be resolved, the world ended. When the outbreak began, Negan was at the hospital with her. She was too sick to survive the initial chaos. She died, and she turned. And Negan was the one standing there when it happened. The comics handle this scene with a quietness that hits harder than any dramatic treatment would. He'd been with her. He'd watched her deteriorate. He'd failed her in the ways he'd failed her, and he'd been trying to figure out how to live with that. And then she died before the conversation was over, before anything could be repaired or properly grieved or even fully acknowledged. He named the bat after her. I want to stay here for a moment because I think this detail is the single most important thing in understanding Negan's entire arc, and it gets mentioned and then passed over in the show in a way that doesn't do it justice. He chose a weapon as the vessel for his grief, not a photograph, not a piece of jewellery, not some quiet private ritual. He took the thing he was going to use to survive the end of the world, wrapped it in barbed wire, and gave it her name. Every person who ever looked at that bat and felt afraid was, in some indirect and distorted way, in contact with Lucille Smith. Every time Negan raised it, he was carrying her. Every time someone flinched, he was making the world acknowledge that she had existed and that losing her had cost something real. There's something almost medieval about it. The way knights named their swords. The way warriors in old stories put the names of the dead on the things that would do violence in their name. It's not rational. It's not healthy. It's grief finding the only shape available to it in a world where all the usual shapes, funerals and memorials, and time to mourn with other people who loved her, were no longer possible. And underneath that, there's the guilt. He hadn't been faithful to her. She had died with that unresolved between them. He couldn't fix it. He couldn't apologise to her in a way she could hear. He couldn't make it right. All he could do was carry her forward into a world that had no room for the kind of softness that repair requires. And carrying her forward meant making her feared, because feared was the only thing worth being in the world the apocalypse had made. That's not villainy. That's a specific, recognisable human grief that turned itself inside out because there was nowhere else to go. Negan didn't become the Negan of the show overnight. There was a period in between the hospital and the sanctuary. Years of it during which he was doing what everyone in that world was doing. Surviving, making decisions under pressure, accumulating experience about what worked and what didn't, and gradually becoming the kind of person that experience makes you. He found a group early on. He kept them alive. This is where his particular combination of traits started to become an asset in ways they hadn't been before. Physical capability matters enormously in the apocalypse, and Negan had it. He'd been an athlete. He kept himself in shape. He could handle walkers in the direct, practical way that people who have genuine physical competence handle physical problems. He wasn't squeamish about it. That matters more than it sounds like it should when you're trying to lead a group of frightened people through a world where hesitation gets you killed. But more than the physical stuff, he had charisma. Real charisma, the kind that operates as a social force, even when you're not deliberately deploying it. People looked at Negan and felt instinctively that he knew what he was doing. That's not always true of him, and it's not always rational for the people who feel it. But as a survival mechanism for a group trying to cohere around a leader in the absence of any institutional structure, it's enormously valuable. Groups that believe in their leader make better decisions under pressure than groups that don't, even when the leader isn't objectively better. The confidence is partially self-fulfilling. And crucially, he had an absence of anything left to lose. Lucille was dead. Whatever he'd imagined his future to be, that was gone. There was nothing the world could take from him that he hadn't already lost in some fundamental sense. People like that are dangerous in one way and indispensable in another. They can make decisions that people with something to protect can't make. They can hold lines that people who are afraid of dying can't hold. They can absorb costs that would break someone who is still hoping for something on the other side of them. Through a series of encounters and confrontations and small escalations that the show never dramatises directly, he became the person those qualities required. The saviours grew around him the way organisations grow around effective people in crises, not from a plan but from accumulation. People joined because he could protect them. Others joined because they were afraid not to. A structure emerged around the protection and the fear together, and the structure, because it worked, attracted more people, which required more structure to manage, which required more enforcement to maintain. At some point, probably through some hard lesson that cost him people he cared about, he figured out the thing that became the foundation of everything he built. You needed both fear and rules, not one without the other. Fear without rules is just chaos with a strong man at the centre, and strong men die eventually, which means chaos returns. Rules without fear are an experiment in goodwill that works until the first serious pressure test, and then fails catastrophically. Fear plus clear and consistently enforced rules create something that can actually sustain itself. Something that people can learn to navigate. Something that, over time, starts to feel less like terror and more like the kind of grim predictability that passes for stability when the alternative is the wilderness. That insight, which Negan arrived at through experience rather than philosophy, is the foundation of the sanctuary. By the time we meet him, he has built something that by the standards of the world he's operating in is extraordinary. Not good, not just, but functional in the deep sense, something that actually runs. The sanctuary at its height was housing roughly 500 people, 500 human beings, fed and sheltered and protected from walkers on a daily basis, inside a world that had been trying to kill everyone for years. That number deserves a moment of recognition before we get into any of the moral complications, because 500 is not a small thing. 500 is a town. 500 is, in the context of the apocalypse, an almost implausible achievement. The sanctuary itself was a factory building, repurposed with defensive modifications, walker-lined fences creating a security perimeter, guard towers, internal organisation by function. It had something resembling a medical capacity, people with some level of skills allocated to keeping other people alive when they were injured or sick. It had production, people maintaining equipment, making things, doing the work that keeps a large group from consuming itself into scarcity. It had a military arm, the Saviours proper, capable of operating across a wide geographic territory, clearing walkers, responding to threats, enforcing the tribute arrangements with satellite communities. The points economy inside the sanctuary is something the show depicts briefly and doesn't examine fully, but it's worth understanding. Residents earned points through work, and points were the currency for accessing food, shelter upgrades, and various goods. More dangerous or more skilled work earned more points. It's not a complicated system, but it's a coherent one. It created incentive structures that kept the community producing. It distributed resources in a way that was visible and rule-governed, which matters psychologically because arbitrary distribution breeds resentment faster than almost anything else. Outside the sanctuary, Negan ran a network of tributary communities: the Hilltop, the Kingdom, Alexandria. Each of them delivered a portion of their production to the Saviours on a regular schedule, and in exchange the Saviours provided security and left them to function. The rate was high, and we'll talk about that in detail in a moment, but the structure itself was rational. Resources flowing from smaller, less defensible communities toward a central power that could deploy force at a scale no individual community could match. The Saviour's regional control also meant something that gets overlooked. They were clearing walkers across a wide area consistently. Every herd that got broken up, every road that got swept, every dangerous concentration of walkers that got dealt with before it drifted into someone's fences, that was Saviour operational activity, creating ambient safety for communities that had no way to generate it themselves. The hilltop's walls meant nothing if an unmanaged herd rolled over them. The kingdom's spearmen were formidable against groups of walkers they knew were coming, far less so against a surprise incursion of hundreds. The Saviour's territorial management made everyone inside the territory safer than they would have been otherwise, and nobody in the tributary communities was fully accounting for that value when they calculated what the tribute cost them. Now, the tribute rate, 50%, is brutal, and it needs to be said clearly. When you're talking about communities operating close to their survival margins, 50% of production extracted to a central power can mean the difference between stability and genuine hardship. There are people in those communities who went hungry because of the tribute rate. There are people whose medical situations got worse because resources that might have helped them went to the sanctuary instead. The human cost of the rate was real, and Negan was aware of it. But strip out the delivery method, the bat and the kneeling, and the theatre of dominance, and what you're looking at structurally is taxation. Resources flowing from dependent communities to a central power in exchange for security guarantees. That is, in its fundamental form, the architecture of every system of governance that has ever functioned at scale. The feudal system in medieval Europe ran on exactly this logic. Lords extracted labour and production from serfs in exchange for military protection and the administration of local justice. The rate of extraction was often higher than 50% when you calculated all the various forms of obligation together, and the justice administered was frequently brutal. But it held civilization together through centuries of conditions that, while not apocalyptic, included plague, famine, and chronic violence that would be recognisable to anyone living in Rick Grimes's world. The Roman system of client states worked the same way. Tributary kingdoms on the edges of the empire sent resources to Rome, maintained roads and military infrastructure Rome could use, and kept themselves in political alignment with Roman interests. In exchange, Rome's legions were available if someone tried to overrun them. The deal was not presented as optional, but it was functional, and the communities inside the Roman sphere generally fared better than those outside it. This isn't an argument that Negan was right. It's an argument that the thing he built, underneath the cruelty of how he enforced it, was recognisably a solution to a real problem, the problem of how you maintain order and security across a dispersed population in the absence of any institutional framework. He solved it the way humans have been solving it throughout history, through a combination of force, rules, and a clear enough value proposition that the people being taxed could calculate, even if they resented it, that they were better off inside the system than outside it. One of the most important things about Negan, and one of the things the show depicts clearly while rarely drawing attention to it, is that he had rules, real ones consistently applied that he held to even when holding them cost him something. The most significant of these was the prohibition on sexual violence. Within the Saviours, rape was a capital offence. Negan didn't make this rule quietly or as an exception to be interpreted loosely. He was explicit about it, and he enforced it with lethality. Men in his organisation who violated it didn't get warnings. They faced consequences that were final and public. In the context of the apocalypse, where armed groups of men operate without any external legal constraint, this rule is not a low bar. It is an active and sustained choice to maintain something that could very easily have been abandoned. Most of the groups we see in The Walking Dead either never had this kind of standard or lost it under pressure. The Claimers, the Wolves, various unnamed groups that Rick's people encountered over the years. None of them showed any evidence of internal standards around this. The terror of what the world had become included, for women in particular, the terror of what people with weapons and no accountability might do. Negan made a decision, early and consistently, that his organisation would not be that. Not out of weakness, because he clearly wasn't operating from a place of squeamishness about violence. Out of a genuine belief that certain things destroyed the internal coherence of a group from the inside. Sexual violence creates the kind of fear and mistrust that metastasizes. It makes the people you depend on unable to function. It turns your organisation against itself in ways that external threats can't. Negan understood this, probably from observation, if not from formal reasoning, and he drew the line. Then there's the rule about not killing members of tributary communities without cause. The Saviours were a military organisation, operating among civilian populations, and military organisations among civilian populations tend, in the absence of strong rules, toward the kind of casual brutality that destroys the populations they depend on. Negan's model required living communities. Dead people don't grow food. Traumatised communities that have lost their most capable members don't produce anything useful. The rule against killing wasn't purely moral. It was also structural. But it was real and he held to it. The Simon arc is where all of this becomes most visible. Simon was one of Negan's most effective lieutenants, genuinely capable, genuinely loyal to Negan personally, and genuinely committed to a philosophy that was a distorted mirror of Negan's own. Simon believed in fear and force, as Negan did. But Simon didn't believe in the preservation component. When a community became inconvenient or costly to manage, Simon's instinct was elimination rather than correction. When Simon's group encountered the scavengers following a betrayal and Simon ordered a massacre, he wasn't acting randomly. He was being consistent with his own logic, which was that a community that had betrayed you once would betray you again, and the efficient solution was removal. When he later pushed for the complete destruction of the hilltop, he was following the same reasoning to its conclusion. Negan's response to learning what Simon had done was fury, and it was real fury, not performance. Because Simon had violated the fundamental premise of everything they were building, the sanctuary's model depended on communities being afraid enough to comply and alive enough to produce. Simon was breaking the machine he was supposed to be maintaining. Negan killed Simon for it, personally in a fight, which is also significant. He didn't order someone else to do it, he did it himself, which is what his code required for a violation of that magnitude by someone of that rank. It was, in its way, consistent. Simon had violated the rules were enforced. The man who enforced them was Negan, not a subordinate acting on his behalf. That's not the behaviour of a sadist who uses rules as window dressing for personal cruelty. That's the behaviour of a leader who genuinely believes in the system he's running, who holds it together by being the person most visibly committed to its principles, and who removes people who undermine it, even when those people are valuable to him. We can't do an honest analysis of Negan without spending real time on the wives, because it's the dimension of his story that is most uncomfortable and most revealing, and the show handles it in a way that's worth unpacking carefully. Negan kept a group of women at the sanctuary, in a designated role. They lived in better conditions than ordinary sanctuary residents. Better food, better quarters, access to a level of comfort and safety that was genuinely scarce in the surrounding world. Negan treated them, within those arrangements, with a kind of theatrical courtliness. He had rules about how his men interacted with them. He made a visible performance of protecting them from the general population. In exchange, They were expected to be sexually available to him. The show frames this as Negan's most sincere claim to voluntary arrangement. He says more than once that no one is forced, that any of his wives can choose to leave the arrangement and return to the regular points economy, that the choice is theirs. And he seems, in those moments, to genuinely believe this. He's not performing a justification he privately knows is hollow. He has constructed a self-understanding in which he is offering something rather than taking something. The problem, and it's a serious one, is what the word voluntary actually means in that context. When one person controls your food supply, your shelter, your physical safety, your access to medical care, and your protection from the men who would harm you without his oversight, and the alternative to the arrangement is simply having less of all of those things in a world where having less of those things means dying sooner and harder. The architecture of that choice is coercive, at its foundation, regardless of what language is used to describe it. The absence of direct physical force doesn't create genuine voluntariness, it just changes the nature of the compulsion. Sherry makes this concrete. Sherry was already partnered with Dwight when she became one of Negan's wives. Dwight had violated a saviour rule that should have cost him his life. The deal that saved Dwight was Sherry agreeing to the arrangement. She chose it technically. She chose it to protect someone she loved, in a situation where the alternative was watching him die and facing the world without him. That's a choice made entirely inside a structure of coercion, and Negan's framing of it as voluntary requires ignoring the structure almost completely. What's psychologically interesting here, and what the show captures with more texture than it gets credit for, is that Negan appears to have genuinely not examined this. He isn't a man who knows he's running a coercive arrangement and chooses the softer language to avoid accountability. He's a man who constructed a narrative around his own behaviour and then inhabited it sincerely, which connects back to the Lucille situation in ways that are worth sitting with. Negan had been unfaithful to his wife while she was dying. He'd constructed a story around that too, probably, the way people construct stories around their worst failures. He'd looked away from the parts that most implicated him and found framings that let him keep moving. He did the same thing with the wives. He built a structure that was coercive at every edge and described it to himself, sincerely, as something he was offering rather than something he was extracting. That's not a simple villain trait. It's a complicated human one. The capacity to build elaborate internal justifications for the things we most need to not look at directly is one of the more universal features of human psychology. It doesn't make Negan's behaviour acceptable. It makes him recognisable. And recognition is the thing that makes him genuinely interesting, rather than just dramatically useful. The relationship between Negan and Carl Grimes is one of the most genuinely interesting things The Walking Dead ever did. And I think it gets less attention than it deserves, because the show embedded it in a season that was frustrating to watch in real time. When Carl infiltrated the sanctuary alone with a gun and killed several saviours before being captured, the outcome was structurally simple. He had attacked Negan's people inside Negan's home. He had demonstrated that he was an active threat. The rules that applied to everyone else in that situation said the response should be severe, either as punishment or as deterrence, or as both. Negan didn't do either. He took Carl on a tour of the sanctuary. He showed him the community, the population, the way things worked from the inside. He wanted Carl to understand what he was attacking when he attacked the saviours. Not just the men with guns and the organisation they represented, but the 500 people behind them who were alive because of that organisation. He cooked spaghetti. He sat across a dinner table from Rick Grimes' one-eyed teenage son and had a conversation with him like a person. The curiosity Negan showed toward Carl was real, and it was specific. Carl had walked into the sanctuary voluntarily, which nobody had ever done. He'd stood in front of Negan without flinching, which very few people managed. He'd killed saviours and still had the composure to negotiate rather than panic when captured. Negan found something in that genuinely compelling, in the way that people who operate at a high level find genuine peers compelling even when those peers are technically their enemies. There's a scene, and it's the scene I keep coming back to, where Negan asks Carl to remove the bandage over his missing eye. He wants to see the wound. Carl does it slowly and Negan stares at it. He stares perhaps a moment too long, and in that moment something happens in Carl's face. Just briefly. A flash of vulnerability, of the grief and self-consciousness he kept buried under layers of performed toughness. He started to cry, just for a second, just a flicker, and then he stopped. Negan's response was immediate. He pulled back. He said something that was, in its way, an apology. He acknowledged that he'd pushed too far, that he hadn't meant to make Carl feel bad about something he clearly carried with him. He shifted the energy in the room. A man who tortures for pleasure doesn't do that. A person who is fundamentally about domination and cruelty doesn't have that instinct. The instinct to recognise when someone has become genuinely vulnerable and to pull back from it rather than press into it. What Negan showed in that moment was a protective impulse, not toward Carl as an asset or Carl as a potential ally, but toward Carl as a kid trying very hard to be something that wasn't a kid, and not quite managing it in that moment, and deserving of something gentler than exploitation. He sent Carl home safely, with a message for Rick. He could have kept Carl. He could have used him as leverage. He could have punished him in ways that would have demonstrated to everyone in the sanctuary. And beyond that, attacking the saviours had costs. He did none of that. He made an exception, with no strategic benefit to himself that outweighed the costs, because something in Carl had gotten past his defences. That gym teacher who stayed late to help the kid who was struggling never fully went away. He was still in there, responding to teenagers who were trying harder than they should have to, with something that wasn't cruelty. The war between Rick's coalition and the Saviours covers most of seasons 7 and 8 of the show, and it's worth being honest about what Negan was actually trying to achieve during it, because the show's framing obscures it pretty substantially. Negan did not want to destroy Rick's group. He said this consistently, and he meant it. His stated goal, from the very first scene in the season 6 finale, was integration. He wanted to add Alexandria, the hilltop, and the kingdom to his existing network. He wanted their agricultural output, their skills, their manufacturing capacity, their population. He wanted more communities functioning inside his system, not fewer communities after a campaign of annihilation. The killings of Glenn and Abraham were, within Negan's logic, a demonstration designed to prevent a longer and more costly conflict. He had dealt with communities that tested him before. He knew from experience what happened when an initial message was unclear or ambiguous. People calculated that the costs of resistance might be manageable, and then resistance continued, and more people died over a longer period, and more resources were consumed, and the disruption to his network was greater. A single devastating, unambiguous demonstration at the beginning was, in his calculation, more merciful in aggregate than weeks of escalating violence. That calculation is horrifying. It's horrifying in the specific way that utilitarian logic can become horrifying when it's applied to individual human lives without adequate weight given to the individuals. But it is a calculation, not random cruelty. There's a difference, and the difference matters for understanding who Negan is. Throughout the war itself, Negan repeatedly pulled punches that a purely self-interested warlord would not have pulled. He had opportunities to kill Rick and didn't take them. He offered surrender terms that his own lieutenants thought were excessively generous. He articulated, even as the fighting continued and his losses mounted, that what he wanted at the end of it was not a graveyard but a network. He also showed during the war the limitations of his model in ways that the show didn't fully explore. The saviours were large enough and dispersed enough that Negan couldn't maintain the same direct control over all of them that he maintained over the Sanctuary's core. Simon was doing things that violated his principles. Other lieutenants were making decisions he wouldn't have made. The system he'd built depended heavily on his personal presence and authority to hold together, which meant it was fragile in the specific way that all highly centralised systems are fragile. Rick won the war. But look at what Rick built in the aftermath. Communities working together, coordinated resource distribution, mutual defence arrangements, regular communication between settlements. The structural logic of what Rick built after defeating Negan looks remarkably like a gentler version of what Negan had been running, without the tribute rate at 50%, without the fear and the bat. But following in its essential architecture, the same intuition that a region of dispersed communities needs some form of coordination and shared resource management to survive. There is a version of this observation that people resist because it can sound like it's minimising what Negan did. It isn't. The methods Negan used were wrong in ways that the post-war community Rick built was not. The terror, the killings, the coercive tribute collection, all of that was genuinely harmful to real people in ways that the Alexandria-centred coalition was not. The human cost of Negan's version was substantial and real. But the structural insight was correct, and Rick's coalition, by adopting the structural insight without the methods, proved it was correct. You need coordination between communities. You need resource sharing. You need some form of mutual defence arrangement with actual teeth. You need a power centre capable of making and enforcing decisions across the network. Rick built all of that after the war, and it worked better than anything he'd built before. And it worked better in part because it incorporated the lessons of what Negan had demonstrated, both in the building and in the breaking. The difference between Negan's version and Rick's version wasn't the vision. It was the method and the moral valence of how the method treated individual people. That's not a small difference. But it's also not the difference between someone who understood the problem and someone who didn't. They both understood the problem. They had different answers to it, and one of those answers was more humane. And one of those answers had been running and working for years before the humane version existed at all. After the war, Rick made a choice that almost everyone around him argued against. He kept Negan alive. He stood in the wreckage of what had just happened and chose not to execute the man who had killed his friends and terrorised his community and made him kneel in the dirt. He imprisoned Negan in a cell in Alexandria and left him there. The scenes that follow, spread across later seasons in fragments, are some of the most quietly significant things the show produced. Negan in a cell is recognisably the same person he was with the bat, but something is working on him that wasn't working before. He's still sardonic. He still has opinions about everything and delivers them with the same timing he always had. He still occupies whatever space he's in more fully than most people occupy open spaces, but there's something visible underneath the performance now that wasn't accessible before. A kind of heaviness that isn't performed and isn't strategic. It's just there. He talked to Judith Grimes through the bars of his cell, and those conversations became some of the most genuinely moving material in the later seasons. Judith had no reason to perform hatred for his benefit, and she didn't. She also had no reason to extend him false sympathy, and she didn't do that either. She talked to him with a directness and lack of sentimentality that was, for Negan, probably the most disorienting thing anyone had done to him since the apocalypse. People either feared him or hated him or were trying to use him. Judith just talked to him. He told her things in those conversations that he hadn't told anyone, about Lucille, about what he'd done and what he'd lost, and what he thought about in the nights when the cell was quiet. Not in a way that was seeking absolution, because Negan wasn't built for that kind of transaction. More in the way that someone finally given enforced stillness starts to actually examine the things that motion had kept at a distance. The escape episode is crucial. Negan gets out briefly and goes into the world beyond Alexandria. He expected to find something waiting, his people maybe, some remnant of the network he'd spent years building. The Saviours had been a large organisation and even dispersed and defeated. He might have expected some core of it to have persisted. There was nothing. The sanctuary was empty and deteriorating. The network was gone. The lieutenants had scattered or died or been absorbed into the new Alexandria-centred coalition. Everything he'd built, every piece of infrastructure and organisation and human coordination that had taken years to construct, had dissolved without him in essentially no time. He came back to the cell voluntarily. I keep returning to that choice because I think it's the hinge of his entire late arc. A man who was purely about power, who had built what he built for the sake of domination and control, would have kept moving. He would have found whoever was left, gathered them around him, started rebuilding. Negan had the skills and the charisma and the reputation to do it. He could have made another attempt at the same structure. He didn't. He came back. Some of that was probably tactical, an understanding that the only relatively safe place for him in that world was inside Rick's protection. But I don't think that's all of it. I think coming back to the cell was an acknowledgement of something he hadn't been able to see while he was still building. That what he'd built had never really been about the 500 people in the sanctuary or the communities in his network. It had been about moving fast enough through a world that had taken Lucille that he never had to fully feel what that loss had made of him. The cell stopped the motion, and when he stopped, when he finally had to just sit with what was left of him, he found that he wasn't ready to do it all again. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the same form. The Whisperer War gave Negan a function in the plot that the show probably needed him to have for structural reasons, but it also did something more interesting, which was to put him in direct contact with a philosophy that made his own look reasonable by contrast. Alpha's philosophy, the Whisperer's philosophy, was the most radical thing The Walking Dead had produced. It wasn't just another version of harsh governance or violent pragmatism. It was the rejection of civilization itself, not as a means to an end, but as the philosophical point. The Whisperers had decided that the pretense of human society was a lie, and that the honest response to the apocalypse was to stop pretending, to wear the skins of the dead, to move through the herds, to become, as nearly as possible, indistinguishable from the things that were killing everyone else. They didn't build, they didn't maintain, they didn't trade or protect or plan. They stripped existence down to the barest possible survival, and called the stripping itself wisdom. Alpha was consistent about this in a way that was genuinely frightening, because it was genuinely committed. She wasn't performing. She wasn't using the philosophy as cover for cruelty, though cruelty was certainly present. She believed it. She had looked at the world as it was and drawn what she considered the only honest conclusions, and she was living those conclusions all the way down. This is the thing that Negan had never done, even at his most brutal. Negan believed in people. His belief was expressed through control and fear, and a tribute system that ground communities down. But it was belief. He built infrastructure because he thought infrastructure was worth building. He maintained communities because he thought communities were worth maintaining. He fed 500 people because he thought 500 people were worth feeding. Somewhere underneath everything he did, there was a commitment to the continuation of something human, something that made the violence instrumental rather than terminal. Alpha didn't have that commitment. Beta didn't have it. The Whisperers had systematically excised it, or believed they had, and were living in the resulting clarity. The scenes between Negan and Alpha while he was embedded with the Whisperers are worth watching carefully. She was trying to reach him with her philosophy, and she made genuine progress. He was in a state of genuine searching during that period, unmoored from his old identity without a clear new one, and Alpha's certainty had a kind of appeal to people in that state. The appeal of giving up, of deciding that the question of how to keep civilization going was not worth the exhaustion of trying to answer it. He considered it, seriously. He didn't dismiss it immediately. He let it sit. And then he rejected it. Not dramatically, not with a speech. He just came to the point where he understood that he couldn't go where Alpha was pointing. That the things she had discarded were things he was, underneath everything, unwilling to discard. That the gym teacher who stayed late to help the struggling kid was still somewhere in the structure, and that person couldn't become what the Whisperers were asking him to become. He killed Alpha practically and without ceremony, which was exactly right. Grand gestures of defiance would have meant nothing to her. A theatrical ending would have been exactly the kind of human meaning-making she'd rejected. He killed her the way you deal with a problem, and the lack of drama was itself a kind of statement. But the arc had done what it needed to do for Negan's character. It had shown us by contrast exactly where his flaw was. He could be brutal, he could be controlling, he could organise human society around fear and tribute. He could do things that were genuinely terrible to individuals in service of what he saw as the collective. But he couldn't become Alpha. And the reason he couldn't was that somewhere inside everything he'd built and everything he'd destroyed, he still cared whether civilization continued. By the time Dead City arrived, Jeffrey Dean Morgan had been playing Negan for nearly a decade, and something in both the character and the performance had settled into a different shape. The Negan of Dead City is unmistakably himself, still funny in that slightly dangerous way, still comfortable in situations that would paralyse most people, still capable of real violence without visible hesitation. But there's a weariness in the performance that sits differently than the weariness of the cell years. It's not the weariness of a man who lost a war. It's the weariness of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and is starting to understand what it's cost him. Manhattan in Dead City is a compressed world that functions as a kind of concentrated test environment for Negan's legacy. The Croat, his former lieutenant, has built something recognisable in the ruins of the city. It has Negan's fingerprints all over it. The hierarchy, the fear, the theatrical enforcement, the tribute logic, the designation of people as resources to be managed. But it's missing the things that made Negan's version of that structure functional. The Croat kept the aesthetics and abandoned the principles. There's a particular kind of horror in watching someone see their own worst impulses reflected back through a funhouse mirror of someone who imitated the surface without understanding the foundation. The Croat built something that looks like what Negan built the way a copy of a painting looks like the original. The shapes are right, the colours are approximately right, but whatever made the original work is somehow missing, and you can feel the absence even if you can't name it. Negan looks at what the Croat has built and clearly, quietly hates it. Not because it's violent or coercive, because his own version was violent and coercive, but because it's purposeless. The Croat isn't maintaining 500 people. He isn't building something that could last. He's just running fear for the sake of running fear. Domination as an end in itself rather than a means to something beyond it. This is the show finally trusting us to make a distinction it spent years avoiding. Negan's version was wrong in serious ways. The Croat's version is wrong in a different, and in some ways more fundamental way. They are not the same thing, and being able to see the difference requires having genuinely understood what Negan was actually doing, rather than just what it looked like from the outside. Negan, at the end of Dead City's first season, is trying to do something right. Not in a redemption arc sense, not with the machinery of atonement that popular storytelling usually deploys for this kind of character beat. just trying to be useful, trying to put back something he helped knock down, using the specific skills that knocking things down requires. It's not clean, it's not comfortable. It's about as honest as late-stage character work in this genre gets. We've been looking at Negan closely for a while now, so let's pull back and look at the full landscape of leaders the Walking Dead universe gave us. Because the case for Negan's complexity is strongest not in isolation, but in comparison. The Governor. Philip Blake kept Woodbury functioning and populated for a significant period before the show's timeline begins, and that shouldn't be forgotten. He had genuine affection for Penny, which tells you something real about his emotional capacity. In his earlier incarnation, before the slide into the Blake we see on screen, he was probably a capable and even decent leader under extreme pressure. But his leadership was built on a foundation of secrets. He maintained Woodbury through a curated version of reality that required ongoing deception, and when that reality was threatened, he had no tools except destruction. He burned the prison not because it was strategically optimal, but because he couldn't tolerate an alternative existing. That's not what Negan did. Negan wanted to incorporate alternatives. The Governor could only eliminate them. Terminus. Before Terminus became what it became, it was a genuine sanctuary. People who built it had a real vision of something good. The transformation into what we find it as came through victimization, through being overrun by people who abused their hospitality and did terrible things, and through the failure to find a path back from what that experience made of them. Terminus is the story of what happens when idealism gets shattered, and the shattering produces something that can only replicate what shattered it. There's no real philosophy in Terminus by the time we see it. Just scar tissue that learned to bite. Ezekiel. The king is probably the most sympathetic leader in the series. He was kind, genuinely kind, not as performance but as orientation. He was decent in ways that Negan wasn't. He built a community around culture and dignity and the preservation of something recognisably human. And his community was, for most of its existence, one bad day away from collapse. Ezekiel's leadership ran on his theatrical persona, and the persona required constant maintenance. When it cracked, Ezekiel had nothing underneath it to fall back on. The kingdom was vibrant and alive and genuinely lovely, and it survived as long as it did largely because the Saviours, ironically, kept the surrounding territory clear of major threats. Ezekiel was also, it should be remembered, running a secret tribute arrangement with the Saviours that he was hiding from his own people. He was paying half their production to Negan and lying to the kingdom about it because he knew they wouldn't accept the arrangement. That's not a clean record. Maggie. Maggie grew into leadership through loss and anger and years of choosing hard things. By the later seasons and into the spin-off, she was arguably the most capable leader in the universe, and watching how she got there is instructive. Her leadership in the later period, the willingness to make decisions that cost individuals in service of the group, the ability to hold things together through force of will when sentiment wasn't enough, the capacity to be genuinely ruthless when ruthless was what the situation required. It rhymes with Negan's approach, expressed with more humanity but following similar structural logic. Maggie never became Negan, but she understood eventually what he had understood, that love is not enough. That leading people in a world like that requires a hardness that love alone can't generate. Rick. Rick is the show's hero in the fullest sense. His love for his people was real, and his sacrifices were real, and his growth over 11 seasons was genuinely moving. But Rick's leadership style was consistently unilateral in ways that kept creating problems. He made decisions alone and then presented them as conclusions. He had a moral code that was genuine, but that operated as a blind spot, as often as a guide. He lost the prison not because he was a bad leader, but because his model of leadership didn't scale. His great strength, the fierce personal loyalty he inspired, was also a limitation. people followed Rick. When Rick wasn't there or when Rick was wrong, the people who followed him often didn't have the tools to adapt. The system that Alexandria eventually built worked better than anything Rick built while he was running it, and it was built after his disappearance, which is probably not a coincidence. None of these people were simply good or simply bad. All of them were trying to solve the same problem, and all of them got some things right and some things wrong. Negan got more things right than his villain framing suggests, and more things wrong than his most ardent defenders would acknowledge. He belongs in this company, complicated and flawed, and genuinely interesting, not above it and not beneath it. Let me offer the reading of the Negan arc that I think the show was reaching toward even when it lost its nerve about committing to it. The Walking Dead, at its most ambitious, was engaging with a question that political philosophy has been arguing about for centuries. Thomas Hobbes asked it most starkly in the 17th century. Without a central power strong enough to enforce order, what keeps human beings from destroying each other? His answer was the Leviathan, a sovereign authority that everyone agrees to obey, because the alternative, the state of nature, is worse than the constraints of submission. The state of nature, Hobbes wrote, was a condition of war of every man against every man, and life in it was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The Walking Dead's world is the literal state of nature. Walkers and human violence and scarcity and disease. All the things that civilization developed over millennia to hold at bay. Suddenly everywhere and unavoidable. The question the show kept asking, in different ways across different seasons and different leadership arcs, was whether the Hobbesian answer was right. Whether you actually need the Leviathan, in some form, to hold civilization together when conditions become extreme enough. Negan was the Leviathan. Imperfect, frequently unjust in the specifics, morally compromised in ways that real sovereigns often are. But holding something together that would otherwise have dissolved into exactly the kind of brutal, fragmented chaos that the state of nature produces. The sanctuary and its network were, in the Hobbesian reading, civilization in its most primitive form. Not good, not just, but functional. Buying time for the people inside it to stay alive, long enough that something better might eventually be possible. The show wanted Rick's victory to prove the Hobbesian answer wrong. It wanted to say that decency and community and love could hold civilization together without the central, terrifying power that Hobbes thought was necessary. And there is genuine truth to that aspiration. Rick's coalition, at its best, was something worth fighting for. But the show kept undermining its own argument. Rick had to do terrible things, consistently, to protect what he loved. Every community built purely on goodwill collapsed under the first real pressure. The people who survived, the ones who were still alive in the later seasons, were the ones who had made the hardest choices, who had learned to hold lines that required real force to hold. The world the show built kept demonstrating, over and over, that Hobbes was more right than a television show with a need for heroes could comfortably acknowledge. Negan was the character who let the show live in that tension without resolving it. He was wrong enough in his methods that you didn't have to accept his model. He was right enough in his analysis that you couldn't dismiss his logic. He was the question the show asked and never fully answered, held in a character compelling enough to keep you watching while the question stayed open. Negan was not a hero. The show never asks us to think he was, and reversing that verdict entirely would be as dishonest as the simple villain reading. He killed Glenn Rhee, who was one of the most genuinely good people the show ever produced, and he killed him in a way designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on the people who loved him. He ran a system of coercion that ground human dignity into functionality and called the result order. He failed the people who trusted him in ways he spent years not examining. He used grief as a justification for cruelty without ever quite naming what he was doing. But he was never simply a villain either. He understood the apocalypse with a clarity that most of the show's characters, including its designated hero, took years to approach. He built something that worked. He had rules and kept them. He had lines he held even when holding them cost him. He protected the people inside his system with a consistency and competence that most of the other leaders in the show's universe couldn't match. He loved someone and lost her, and carried that loss forward in the only form available to him. And then, eventually, in a cell in Alexandria, in conversations with a child who talked to him like a person, he started to look at what he'd built and what it had cost and what it meant. Not in a clean narrative arc toward redemption. In the slow, uneven, incomplete way that real people actually change when they're finally given enough stillness to see themselves. The thing that makes Negan genuinely interesting, as opposed to just dramatically useful, is that the show gave him interiority. Most antagonists in long-running genre television are defined entirely by function. They create problems. They threaten the protagonists. They represent something thematically. The good ones get a backstory. The great ones get a psychology. Negan got a psychology. An ugly one, a complicated one. One that implicates the viewer in ways that are uncomfortable. Because understanding how someone's psychology works is not the same as approving of what it produces. But it rhymes with approval closely enough that it can be hard to hold the distinction clearly. The show used that discomfort deliberately in its best moments. It wanted you to find Negan funny, and then feel bad about finding him funny. It wanted you to follow his logic, and then feel bad about being able to follow it. It was doing something real and somewhat brave with the character, and then sometimes it pulled back from it because television has commercial pressures and audiences have comfort thresholds. But the core of it is still there in the text if you're willing to sit with it. A man who built an empire around the terror of losing anything else after losing the one thing that mattered. A man who understood what the world required and provided it. At a cost he mostly didn't examine and partly couldn't see. A man who, given enough stillness, turned out to still be someone. The Walking Dead gave us, in Negan, a study in something specific and real. What happens to certain kinds of people when grief and capability and a complete absence of external constraint come together? What gets built? What gets lost? What stays underneath everything, stubbornly and inconveniently present? He named the bat after her because he couldn't carry her any other way. I keep coming back to that sentence. Because in it, the whole thing lives. The love and the guilt and the loss and the violence and the gym teacher who coached teenagers and the warlord who made a region kneel and the man in a cell talking to a child through bars, trying to figure out if there was anything left in him worth something. The show never fully answered the question it built him to ask, but it asked the question for long enough, and with enough honesty in the better moments, that the asking itself was worth something. That's where Negan lives. In the question, in the uncomfortable space between the villain you were supposed to see and the thing that was actually there. If you want to keep going tonight, the next video is already on screen. We're spending a long time with the governor, and whether his collapse from Philip Blake into the thing at the prison fence was inevitable from the first day of Woodbury, or whether there was a moment, somewhere in there, where it could have gone differently, that one will carry you through. Sleep well.